Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Greg Whyte and Professor Andy Lane, and we're going to be talking all things the psychology of endurance. Gentlemen, welcome.
Well, thanks for having us. Great to be here.
Really excited to have you both on. Somewhat intimidated. The brains are through the roof here today. Two professors and humbly myself. So I'll try and live up to my own expectations here. Before we get started, I mean, Andy, you've been on the show before, so excited to have you back. But Greg, a first-time guest. I've followed your career for a number of years as a sports psychologist, but I'm sure so many people listening in will know who you are and what you do. But give us a brief biography here.
Cool. Formerly I was an athlete, so I was fortunate enough to be an Olympian. I was a world and European medalist at a very bizarre sport called modern pentathlon, which I will be testing you on later in the show. And around that time, there was no money at all. So therefore, you either studied or you worked alongside training. I've tried to avoid work my entire life. And so I studied. And I did, in fact, me and Andy are graduates, alumni of Borough Road, both from Borough Road as an undergraduate. I then did an MSc in the US, came back and did my PhD at St George's Hospital Medical School. And then the two worlds of sport and academia collided, and I became the first director of research at the British Olympic Medical Centre. I then went on to be the first director of science at the English Institute of Sport. And then I went on to be the first director of science at the Irish Institute of Sport and helped set them up. And then went on to become effectively an academic in an academic post at Liverpool John Moores, where I still am as a professor of applied sport and exercise science.
Professor Lane, beat that, sir.
Greg and I have known each other since 1988.
And it shows, doesn't it?
It shows. We've stayed 27. I'm a professor of sports psychology at the University of Wolverhampton. I've been there since 2000. I did my first degree, then 4 degrees at Brunel, and so PGC, MSc, PhD. I've done lots of research in ultra and endurance sport, quite a lot of it with Greg. We've actually just published or about to publish a paper on useful strategies, which funnily the proofs came in this morning. And not in comparison to Greg, but I've also done quite a bit of endurance sport. So I always think there's a very much a personal interest to how can you get better at this. And I read and do research to try and apply it to myself as much as try to help the various people I've worked with.
Well, Greg, you have released a documentary, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. That documentary is entitled Unstoppable: Inside the Mind of the Extreme Triathletes. I had a good watch of this morning, enjoyed it thoroughly. It exhausted me just by watching it. As I said to you gentlemen off air before we clicked record, but there's so many golden nuggets in there from a psychological perspective. So I'm so looking forward to unpacking this with the both of you. But I think to start us off here, Greg, I mean, a documentary on being an extreme triathlete. Where did this idea come from?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, it's actually the second in a series that we're doing. So the first one was the Norseman. It's black and white, it's called. A little bit of a play on words, obviously. But actually, the Norseman, they call the toughest triathlon on the planet, is all about the black T-shirt. It's the elusive black T-shirt that you're trying to get. Top 160 get a black T-shirt. So it was black versus white or white versus black. I've been around endurance, obviously been around sport my entire life, but more latterly around endurance and ultra endurance. And also I was fortunate enough to look after sport relief, comic relief, and children in need, the big challenges. So I've looked after 36 of those. So ranging from David Williams swimming the Channel and Davina McCall and John Bishop and Eddie Izzard and all those guys. And so it's sort of, it feels like a lifetime in that area. And I think what we got to the point where speaking with a good friend of mine, who's a filmmaker, is that actually, to my mind, what we're seeing now is a sort of a renaissance of challenges, of people challenging themselves in these endurance and ultra endurance. And that, I would say, sort of began in the late 80s, mid 80s, early 80s perhaps, but mid 80s, with things like the London Marathon, which is almost common parlance now. But running a marathon is a proper endurance challenge. And we've sort of made it as if it's something easy that you can tick off, and it absolutely is not. But since then, we've seen this rise now, and we've sort of gone longer, gone harder, and so the marathon has now become the Marathon des Sables. Olympic distance triathlon has become Ironman triathlon and beyond. So what we've seen over the past 2 or 3 decades is we've seen this rise, not only in the sort of size of the challenge, but also in the population that are actually challenging themselves to it. It's become a real thing. And so, to some extent, what I felt as part of the film is that what we can do is impart some of the skills and expertise and experience that I've had over the time, and actually work that we've done with Andy. Not just psychology, it's effectively sports science. So we put an awful lot of things. We talk about cold exposure, we talk about the after drop, we talk about coping with those type of things. We talk about hypothermia, as well as talking about the psychology and the biomechanics, and it's just trying to bring, I think, a sense of what sports science is into the real world, and hopefully giving people ideas of how they can improve their own performance.
What I find fascinating is that, watching the documentary, and I'm going to come to you, Andy, here, watching the documentary. I mean, Greg, you speak about it's not just all sports psychology, it's the promotion of sports science. And I hear you. At the same time, I feel that everything that you did in that documentary, whether it's the cold exposure, whether it's the equipment that you used, certainly the team around you, this is still psychology in action, isn't it? In many respects, psychology is so embedded into the environment, in the mini conversations that you're having with the team, the equipment that you use, the choices, the decisions that you make, the protocols that you enact every single day. Andy, I mean, psychology is present all the time. Am I being a biased sports psychologist here?
No. No. I mean, so I have worked with Greg on a lot of these, or some of these projects, and what you get is the planning builds confidence. You unpack, so you take this thing where you get the bike, and you come out of that bike session thinking, I'm on the best bit of equipment I could possibly be on. I'm in the best position I could possibly be on. And you look at that. There's a whole industry of cyclists in desperate search for that, and paying an enormous amount of money for wheels and stuff like that. But you take the planning of it. Okay, we're doing this is the challenge. It's got cycling in it. We're going up a lot of hills. What's the dynamics of the action we need to be? How do we train that? And the person gets that and then turns that into a series of training. And then they monitor it. And we talk of the bits around goals, being clear on your progress and gaining motivation from that progress. Whether that's Christine Bleakley learning that her biggest skill to do the water ski challenges, or the biggest strength she's got, is that she just won't stop, and she'll always get up and get out onto the water again. Or it's David Walliams' almost unstoppable belief he can keep going swimming. It's breaking it down into simple bits and building confidence via planning. It's planning, and it's not. I mean, it's so much of what Greg does is not about bringing in psychological skills, but the actual planning around does it. Almost encourages the person to be very thoughtful, reflective, which builds psychological skills by default.
I love everything you said there, Andy, and in particular honing in on that notion of preparation builds confidence. And I love during the documentary, Greg, you talk about a happy bank, and we're gonna speak to that, and how that's how you feel is underpinned biochemically. You think of the biopsychosocial aspects of training and the athlete in general. So, I'm keen to unpack that more. But where I want to start is almost where the documentary opened. questions where the interviewer basically says, why do you put yourself through this? And you just look with a wry grin and say, well, I can't help myself. You see, I know I can help myself. I don't fancy that triathlon at all. I can assure you of that. So you can't help yourself. So I think this is interesting. Is this, Greg, is this inbuilt for you? Can you build it into others? And really, playing on this idea of helping David Walliams and these celebrities, have you when you reflect back on that, did you have to help them build that sort of sense of motivation? A bit of a motivational piece here, Greg.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting one, and I think often motivation is like the buzzword, isn't it? Particularly in sports psychology, about it's all about motivation, and then you say to people, what? How do I get that motivation? Where's that motivation come from? And I think to some extent, my attitude is that actually motivation comes last. Motivation is created. It doesn't. We often talk about people who, they're really motivated and that's why they do it. And I'm absolutely not sure that's true. I don't think people are innately motivated or innately unmotivated. And I think actually what we are doing is, for me, there's sort of this cycle. I've written about this in one of my books, but this is this idea of where we start with belief. And I think if we're going to go into something, what we've got to do is that we've got to believe that we can be successful. And if we believe we can be successful, what we then do is we then move on to the next stage, and that is commitment. Is that, I use this phrase that I use in the documentary quite a few times, but nothing good comes easy. And I think that, to some extent, there's also another phrase that I sometimes use, and that is that nothing great is ever achieved from the sofa. And it does take commitment, and that commitment comes in lots of different guises. It comes in a personal, physical commitment to a challenge in this sense, but it also comes to the fact that you've got to commit the time. And I've got a family, I've got 3 kids, I've got a busy work life, and so therefore I'm going to commit the time. But how do I do that? How do I structure that? And that speaks to what Andy's talking about in terms of planning. Is that, yes, I'm going to commit the time, and then also I'm going to commit the resource. And I think what Andy brought up earlier was a really important point, a really interesting point, and that is that sometimes what people think is that they forget about these other commitments, and what they think is that they can buy performance, and so therefore they can buy motivation. So what I can do is that, the legs are weak, aerobic capacity is poor, but I'm going to smash this bike ride by buying a £20,000 bike. That's the answer. The more I spend, the better I'll be, which is utterly erroneous, And so I think, so it's that belief that drives the commitment. And what we find is that the more we commit, the more success we have, particularly if we planned it well in terms of short-term goals. And then what we do is all of a sudden we set this short-term goal. And the short-term goal this week is to do 5 sessions this week, is a run total of 20 kilometers, whatever that is. And that short-term goal at the end of the week, all of a sudden we've committed to it because we believe we can achieve it. And all of a sudden we've achieved it, we tick the box. And then all of a sudden we think, wow, then the motivation comes in, because now you've looked at it and thought, do you know what? I actually could do this because I've done this first step. And then it goes around in the circle again. So now what we've done is, with that motivation, we've now increased that belief that we can deliver. So therefore we re-engage with the commitment. And so what we do is we then commit to it again. We see success, we get motivation, and it becomes this circle until eventually, but from the outside looking in, what you do is you look at people and think, my God, they're motivated. And you think, that's because they were born motivated. And it simply isn't that, I don't think. It is about the structure of how you approach these projects, which, and I dare to say that is life in general, whether it's a business approach or whether it's a personal, an approach in personal life. It is about that structure which will deliver motivation, which will keep you going.
Andy, I'm going to come to you. Thanks so much, Greg. That's absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to come to you here because I want to reflect back to you what I hear Greg say there. And I'm going to be the psychologist here. I feel a real self-efficacy theme here going on. That self-belief, Albert Bandura's concept of self-efficacy. maybe an element of belief to get started in the first place. I can achieve this. But even if you don't have that, what Greg is essentially saying is you can potentially create that belief through commitment. And there seems to be an interesting dichotomy here between commitment and motivation. And really, I'm kind of, in my mind, thinking about motivation being probably people perceiving that more towards the affective dimension, the feeling dimension, whereas Greg's kind of alluding here to me, a commitment being more cognitive. I am going to intelligently go about creating a commitment loop here. I'm going to set short-term goals. I'm going to complete those goals. I'm going to show myself evidence that I can achieve, hence injecting self-efficacy into oneself, and so on and so forth. You have a strong, strong experience in endurance sports. I mean, what's your thoughts on all of that, Andy?
And almost to go back a step further, in the reason they start is often they've got a really big goal.
Okay.
So you've got David Walliams to serve all that stuff for charity. Greg's ambitions around doing these enormously difficult challenges, which he sets himself, and they're on in Greg's case, they're almost unbreakable. In David Walliams' case, at the start points, they're very hopeful. And interestingly, in that process, and this is why it's not, when we start talking about this, I'm evident that people might think, well, what you're going to do is you're going to set up a training program which is all about making sure it's successful every time, because that isn't the case. It's about exposing them to what the challenge is. David Walliams in his early stages said, I'm doing the channel, and he switches it to saying, I'm trying to do the channel. And there's a switch in the goal focus, which I think is really good, again, in Greg's work. It's about being engaged in the process of the training, process of the improvement, and moving that forwards. And then with your training goals are focused in processes, and outcomes such as I'm going to achieve this are these things that get drawn into very, very infrequently, because they sometimes are the shining light to get you out of a dark hole. That's why I'm doing this. That's the big goal. But you can't keep going back to using that, because you downplay its importance. I mean, the theoretical framework we can stick on this. Yes, it's self-efficacy to a point, but in and around that, it's the appraisal of what's coming back to you. So you have to believe that there's progress being made. You have to attribute it to personal qualities within yourself, hopefully relatively stable ones. And the model is the control of effect theory by Carr and Schweier, one of those process models where the rate of improvement, the rate of feedback is actually saying that you're getting to your goal faster. The process of moving towards it is faster, not the outcome necessarily, because you in most of these ultra endurance events, you get nowhere near the outcome. We worked with an ultra runner who would never she'd be running for 24 hours. The longest run in training was 5 or 6. Because the damage you do physiologically means that you can't prepare you can't do a 12-hour run, but you do have to try and get the mind into what it's like to be running after 12 hours. So you need to just you feed that, so you're actually thinking that you're getting there. You've got the qualities to get there.
Just briefly dwelling on this. What I love about what you said there about the David Walliams scenario, I was thinking of the importance of language. I mean, I'm getting in amongst the weeds here, but it had a real rational, emotive feel to it in terms of I'm not going to do the channel. I'm going to strive to cross the channel, or however he changed his language. And I think that actually fascinating, that rationalization of what you're trying to do, maybe to turn down the volume of stress. So that's just an aside here, but just from you talk about there, Andy, the importance of appraisal. And I suppose if we're talking about self-efficacy, because I'm giving you a case study of one here. This is me talking to you guys, and I'm going, I hear you both, and I hear you both about the importance of belief as a starter, and having a why as well. That big, hairy, audacious goal, if you want to call it like that. I've got a big why. At the same time, where my mind goes is like, if we dwell on Bandura's theory of self-efficacy, one of those sources is physiology and emotion, physiological and emotional experiences. And I'm just kind of thinking, well, I might have a big why, but equally, I might just think, I'm just not going to enjoy this. This is going to be so exhausting. So I'm not going to do it. So I'm not going to get started in the first place. And I'm not too sure what category. Is that more intrinsic motivation? It's kind of not. Have you got to still have the intrinsic motivation alongside the belief, alongside the why? The sense of enjoying it and doing it for the sake of doing it. Why I'm saying this, Greg, what strikes me is the difference between you and me is that you'll have a sense of enjoyment of pain. And I'm like, I don't want to be in pain, so I'm not going to do this. Just some rambles there for you, no question.
But I think, but what you're suggesting is that to my mind, it's about expectation. Is that I think, if I'm trying to lose weight, if I go into this weight loss program thinking to myself, do you know what, this is going to be absolutely fantastic. It's going to be so easy. I'm going to love every minute of this. Then actually at day one, you're going to give up. Because it isn't, and I think much of it actually, I think much of the sort of, I hate the word failure, but much of not reaching your goals is often about the expectation of what that process is going to look like. And to my mind, I think what you should always remember is that, that nothing good comes easy. This is going to be tough. And so to that end, it's always this for me, is that when it starts to get tough, my expectation is that is how it should be. And so therefore what I'm doing is I'm delivering to the goal of that session or the challenge at either end of that spectrum, is that I come into a session thinking, do you know what? And listen, I can tell you the point at which it starts to get miserable on specific sessions. That doesn't stop me doing the session. What it tells me is I get to that point, and when it starts to get miserable, I think, to some extent, it gets much less miserable because I know it's going to be miserable. Yeah. And so therefore, it's about the coping strategy of that is actually just effectively accepting that there are going to be points along this path that are going to be difficult to handle. And I think if you can do that, what that does, that enables you to keep going.
You have quite a sophisticated relationship with pain.
Yeah. But again, so it is an interesting one, and I'm sure I mentioned this in the documentary. But to my mind, actually, pain is incredibly relative.
Okay, is
that what I am teaching my brain? And listen, if you ever come and do a training session with me, I remember doing this once with Greg James. It was absolutely brilliant. Greg came in, and I've done a couple of challenges with Greg James, and he'll tell you the story of this. But he came in to do a session one day, and he said to me, "Oh, well, Whitey, what are we doing today?" I said, "Today, Greg, I'm going to reset your misery gauge." And he looked at me and went, "What are you talking about?" I said, "When I tell you to do something hard, you have got a perception that this here is hard. That's where your gauge sits. The top of your gauge, your misery gauge, sits here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reset that. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the top end of your misery up here." Now, to what end does that do that? Well, it's a proper miserable session. But I tell you what, every session subsequent to that, that you used to think was miserable, you've now got a standard against which you can set it. And you can say, actually, it's only 70% miserable. Yeah. Whereas before it was 100% miserable. And so I think that what we do is we can actually teach the brain, that central governor in this process, we can teach the brain what misery is, and we can reset that gauge so that, much like any Likert scale that goes from 0 through 10, what we're doing is we're teaching ourselves, because most people in general life, we operate around 5. And that, or we're pushing ourselves, we're really pushing ourselves at 5. Very few people get to 8, and virtually nobody gets to 10. Whereas actually, if you can gradually move that gauge and move it up, all of a sudden, what's required, what may be required is all that we need to do is 5 and 6. But all of a sudden, that 5 and 6 now feels like 2 and 3. So it's less miserable, and so therefore it's more manageable.
Yeah, and I mean, what Greg does in training and is excellent, building of that psychological strength, is typically multiple short intervals. So one of his sessions is 100 times 100 meters swimming, which makes me laugh because it takes hours. But you say, but he's a good swimmer, so that takes. But you can people can do 10-second bursts, and so you go, "What can you do? Can you do 10 times 10-second bursts?" And most people say, "Yeah, I can." So, well, that's us. I'll start, and within very quick period of time, they've moved up to 20 to a 10-second burst. Then with even quicker times, they're up to 20 seconds. And then they're 30 times seconds. And now they're 40, they're 50, they're 60, which comes a bit of a pain in the backside to count. But what you've got there is every time, 40 sessions, 40 reps in, it hurts a bit. But you've still got the belief that you can get to 60 because it's short and you've pitched it. And all that is just, that sound, you just stretch that. But the belief comes at some point that someone goes, actually, I can do 20 seconds, I can do 30 seconds. Let's put it to a minute. And the person then starts pushing that barrier themselves. You're not doing it. They then push it back. So I can go almost as hard as I can now for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And then the physiology then of their body being able to adapt to be able to cope with harder sessions, they're rechanging what hurts and that they can cope with discomfort changes. And their belief that they can sit in the zone changes. And then with some tips, you're going, well, instead of focusing on your breathing really hard, because that's going to be absolutely right in your head, why don't you, going up that hill, learn to relax your arms and try and get a circular image in your head so you can pedal a bit more smoothly? Or why don't you try and relax your shoulders and pump your arms a bit? Or why don't, and so you some key parts of technique or some key ways of smoothing movement, listening to rhythmical music to smooth the actions, then makes the process far more tolerable. And it's not a macho thing. It's because almost the other part to all of this is, it's as you talk about this, that is some people assume it's a macho. It's absolutely not. It's just a learned process to going, actually, this doesn't hurt as much as I think as it used to. And and becoming really used to it, not really used to it. For me, the first 5 minutes of exercise are almost always the hardest because I'm so in. It's like a diesel car.
Can I just pick up one thing, because we've said it inadvertently sort of 3 or 4 times, and I think it is the biggest mistake that people make is the assumption that training sessions are targeting one specific element of this sort of the variety of different determinants. The bottom line is what Andy's just described there beautifully is the fact that actually going up that hill, he has done physiological, he's done psychological, he's done technical, he's done tactical. And actually, if he'd have mentioned about when he was going to take some fluids on, he'd have done nutritional at the same time. And of course, all of that is associated with biomechanics. So I think what we should always remember is that every session has an outcome, and that outcome, it could be predominantly be physiological, but to my mind, what you have to be very careful about here is that yes, it's physiological, but what is the actual target? So if you look at my plans, every session has got a specific target, and so that target could be VO2 max, it could be lactate tolerance, it could be aerobic capacity, it could be speed maintenance. But that's the physiological aspect of it. Wrapped around that is how am I going to deliver that? Well, I'm going to deliver that psychologically in this way, technically in this way, tactically in this way, nutritionally in this way. And so I think it's really important that people remember that you are developing everything simultaneously. You don't do 6 months of physiology and then all of a sudden switch on the psychology and do a couple of months of psychology. Everything is done simultaneously.
And what you said at the end there, Greg, I think is so pertinent and really gets to the heart of this podcast, because it's that integration piece, isn't it? And it's seeing all of these components integrated into training, into performance, into development, into engagement. And I'm passionate about helping sports participants, sports competitors view the biopsychosocial component or components as integrated into technical, tactical, physical, biomechanical, and so on and so forth. I just do want to hone in on something you mentioned there, the central governor theory or principle, however you want to describe it. This is really important for us in sport to potentially understand or grasp, because I think so much of sport, and maybe I'm orienting towards the elite side of sport or the developing elite side of sport here. So maybe slightly adults in sport, if you like, or late teens. Coaches talk a lot about the importance of taking athletes outside of their comfort zone. They've got to push their comfort zone, and this changes coach behavior. This changes coaching approaches. A lot of coaches base their whole all of their behaviors around this. They want to help athletes come out of their comfort zone. And this central governor, I believe it's Professor Tim Noakes. I'd love you to speak to this a little bit, Greg. That would be brilliant, because I think what Andy's done there as well is broken down, how to change that central governor, or readjust or adjust that central governor. Can you speak a bit to that, Greg?
Sure. And Tim's a friend of mine. So Tim Noakes, South Africa. Anybody who's in sports science will know that he's a god in terms of sports science. What's interesting, though, about the central governor hypothesis, effectively what Tim came out and said was, look, take a look at every physiology book that's ever been published. Take a look at every physiology lecture, and what they do is that they cut the head off. And that's how he describes it. And actually, it's an interesting one, because then you think, no, don't talk rubbish. And then you look through every physiology text and you realise they haven't got a head. But what he was alluding to was the fact that actually the brain is fundamentally important in the governance of what the body does. Now, of course, when you put it like that, well, of course it is. I mean, but for so long, people sort of ignored it. And I think that this speaks to our previous point, and that is this idea that we do physiology today, and then next month we'll start working on the psychology. I mean, it's just utter nonsense. These are fully integrated systems. And what the central governor theory was really talking about, and I think, to my mind, I think people misinterpreted what Tim was saying, and I think actually perhaps the way Tim said it, allowed people to misinterpret it, and that was that it then became this bun fight of what's more important, the periphery or the brain, the central governor. What's more important in this process. And I think the bottom line is, what we do know is that actually it is an integrated system. And people ask me, what I do. My kids ask me what I do all the time, because they have no idea, probably nor do I. But the one thing I do say to them is, look, my job fundamentally is integrative physiology. So what is that? Well, the anatomy of the parts. So the brain is, part of the body, as is the heart, the lungs, the muscles, etc. The physiology is how they function, but physiology per se is often reductionist. That it brings everything down to a single organ. So how does the heart work? And I spent 3 decades working on cardiovascular function. But critically, what matters is not only about how they work individually, it's how they work as part of that system. So it's this systems physiology, which then by necessity has to bring the brain in. And what we have to remember is that the governance of this process is from feed-forward feedback mechanisms from the periphery to the brain, which then interprets those and then sends out messages. And so it's a constant loop process where the brain is central to that. And when we talk about endurance performance, it's why, on this particular documentary, we talk so much about it, is that so much of performance is linked to what the brain thinks and what the brain believes is possible. And the periphery is giving feedback into that about fatigue, about temperature, about et cetera, et cetera. But the brain is telling us consciously or subconsciously, we can do this or we can't do this.
And so I'd love to get your opinion on this, because my understanding is there are arguments as to whether this is shiftable or changeable. And from what my understanding from what you're saying is that you can shift this, you can teach the brain new limits. This is possible, because my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, Greg, that there are people out there who would say, no, it's not shiftable, it's not changeable.
I think it's definitely changeable, but again, what you have to remember is it's an integrated system. Is that you cannot change the brain without changing the body.
Yeah.
So you cannot, a very simple example of that is that, look, I'm going to do a park run. I want to run sub 25 minutes, but I can't currently run a single kilo in 5 minutes. It doesn't matter how much the brain tells you can run sub 25 minutes. physiologically, you simply don't have the capacity to run 5 minutes consistently for 5 kilometers. And so therefore, is it changeable? It is. But what you've got to do is you've got to change everything in order to make to move on that. So the idea that I can sit in a room and just do psychology and tell myself I'm going to be better is utterly erroneous unless you're making sure that everything else changes. And I talk about this ad infinitum when it comes to physiology. The fact is that I can increase my VO2 max to 80, but that doesn't mean to say my marathon time is going to improve. Because if I haven't got the strength and power to actually sustain a velocity over 26 miles, then I'm not going to be able to deliver it, irrespective of what the engine looks like. If the wheels aren't of high enough quality, you're not going to be able to move at a fast enough speed to maintain it. So from a physiological perspective, we would understand that it's not just about aerobic capacity. The determinants of running performance include maximum running velocity, it includes running economy, it includes velocity at VO2 max and anaerobic stroke lactate threshold. So there are a number of determinants. In order to get better, you have got to improve each of those determinants. And so therefore the same is true with the brain, is that it's not, you can't just improve your thinking about what is achievable without changing the other determinants of performance.
Which brings us back to you, Andy, and it strikes me that you'd agree with me that we therefore, whether it's as a sports psychology practitioner, consultant, whether it's a coach trying to deliver on a psychological side, that we have to do precisely what you said, which is improve ourselves tactically, technically, physically, but at the same time do those subtle psychological things that influence the attentional cues that you were speaking to, chunking our behaviors and so on and so forth. That's how we can best potentially impact, and coaches can best impact a player, a participant, a competitor's mindset and overall achievement, is by incorporating psychology into the performance environments.
Absolutely. I mean, the central governor is in essence the brain protecting the body from the person from running themselves to death. And the brain, the selfish brain it takes glucose when the body wants glucose. It protects itself. The brain is like the boss of the physiology, in simple terms. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. The brain has to take the resources first, so accepting that. But then we learn what we'd like to do is like to tell the brain is that actually my goal here to run as fast as possible might actually seem a bit silly to you, who seem to have got this parent over me type thought, thinking that you're telling me to run slow and I don't want to run slower. So if I say to you, how about I bargain, I'll keep going at this pace for another 10 seconds. Can you cope? And the brain eases off a bit. Oh, well, you can have that then. And then we start getting little techniques where we break it down. I'll just do another 10 seconds. I'll just get to that part there, and then the person then negotiates themselves through the process without having to slow down. So you bring in tips to break that down, to actually overcome the brain telling you to slow down, and then actually say, well, then you can rationalise it. Nothing has happened, or both legs are still on there, and you keep going and so on. And then you bring in techniques around to try and ease that process, so that you're amazed that if you can focus on a process-based goal, such as turning your legs over, cycling, possibly pushing on alternates in counts of threes, runners at counts of fours, trying to force the brain into doing something else. The narrative that comes with you must slow down, which probably coming from the central governor, is quietened. I think one of the benefits of music in training is that you can't hear yourself moaning.
Right. My music has to be particularly loud in that moment when I'm moaning.
Exactly.
And coming back to that documentary that you've created, Greg, maybe we're honing in on something here with relation to what we're talking about. You talk extensively about building your happy bank. You're setting short-term goals to get short-term wins. Tell us a little bit about the happy bank, and obviously you were trying to build this as you were training for this extreme triathlon.
Well, it's an interesting. I machinated much about whether to use the term happy bank because
I like it.
There's all sorts of other things we could call it, but
Yes.
there's certainly plenty of acronyms off of it. But I mean, I think to some extent it is about the fact that these things are difficult. And it always sounds a bit trite when you say it. Look, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. And they would, we wouldn't be talking about a documentary if what I'd done is a challenge which had been, run around the block and swim 2 links. These things are very difficult, and I think that what we're always trying to do, and it's that sort of balance within the brain of the positive and the negative, and Andy's just sort of spoken to that. Is that I think what we have to do is we have to build this reserve of positive knowledge and positive experience, so that actually when it does get miserable, what we are doing is we're drawing. So and effectively what we're doing is we're investing that, and we're putting that in the bank. Let's call it the happy bank, and we're investing it in there so that at some point in the future, what we can do is we can draw upon it. And Andy articulates that beautifully, and that is the point at which you think, can I keep going, or am I going to die? And you just take a look in the happy bank and you realize actually 3 weeks ago I did this session which was exactly the same feeling. I kept going and nothing happened. So actually we're okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to withdraw a little bit of that from the happy bank at this precise moment in time to actually allow me to cope with the misery that's going on currently. And so what we're doing is it constantly is interplay. Can I keep going to some extent? Whether it's can I keep going at this pace? Can I make it to the finish? How much further we got to go? All those type of things. Is that interplay between the positive and the negative? But I think critically, often people think, again, that you look at people, you think, well, they were born hard. They could absolutely it's just incredible. I just don't have that skill. Well, to my mind, it's not a skill and it's not innate. It's very much learned. It's very much nurture rather than nature. And so the happy bank really is this exposure in training to the types of misery and the types of questions. So, I talk often, and me and Andy have spoken about this on many occasions, about things, if-then plans. That if something goes wrong, then this is the solution. And I think actually, the happy bank fundamentally is that. It's just sort of, renamed and rescheduled in the sense that it's an if-then plan. That when I'm in the middle of a challenge and it's really, really miserable, what am I going to do about it? I'm actually going to take a look at what my experiences have been in the past. And somewhere in that library, I know that I've been here before and I know that I can keep going. And so what I'm going to do is extract on it. But the key thing, which I talk about in the documentary when it comes to the happy bank, though, is that you need that happy bank to be as full as possible before you take on that big challenge. In other words, you've got to have done as much training as is required in order to deliver on that long-term goal. If you come into that challenge with limited reserves in that happy bank, you are destined to failure. And so it brings us back to the very start, and what we're constantly reinforcing here is that it is about planning and preparation. It underpins all of this, and the happy bank is just one of those models.
If then thinking, which I know very well, sounds like you're intellectualizing positive thinking, and I love it. And I was going to actually ask both of you, as professors of your subjects, your daily life when you're working in academia has to veer surely towards the skeptical side. You're striving to reject the null hypothesis. You have to take a skeptical eye on the material in front of you. And yet when you go and compete, when you go and challenge yourself, you have to fill up the happy bank. That feels like you have to flex quite hard between those two worlds.
We've done loads of research in the benefits of placebos, beliefs. We've just I've just written a chapter with Tracy and Ross, which is a model of using placebos, and the idea that if you believe in what you're going to be doing, you get yourself a lot further down the journey than if you're really negative. Going into something, and you think, I'm going to try this, and you're so cautious about it, you hamstring yourself. It might not be, the drugs that work really effective are usually illegal, is what I was told by one nutritionist. And so always some part of belief in there is really beneficial. And so being overly skeptical is a pretty not a good way to be. It's not necessarily a good way to be. Blindly positive is much more helpful and or hopeful.
Okay.
Sort of the Shawshank Redemption. Never give up on hope.
I think where you're trying to get to though is healthy skepticism is where you're trying to get to. Is I think you have to question, and part of that questioning process is actually reinforcing the outcome of it. Because I think, and you spoke about coaches earlier. I think coaching is a really interesting one, because I think much of our belief system, like particularly in sport and performance, much of our belief system comes from experience. Is that I did this and the outcome was positive, but it's only when I've done it and get the outcome that I really believe it. And of course, the opposite can be true, is that I've already tried that. Classic conversation with a coach. Yeah, we did that last year and it didn't work. And of course, actually, it wasn't necessarily that. It was the way in which it was planned in the program at the wrong point, at the wrong time, wrong intensity, the wrong preparation, etc. And you've got to unpick that. But I think it is that process of skepticism. I mean, being questioning, I think it's a real valuable trait. Some of the guys that I look after, I think we spend more time talking about what's the evidence for that than we do just look. It's not a didactic approach. It's not like you do this and they go and do it. It shouldn't. And if it is like that, I think you're in a bit of trouble, because there's no learning going on. Because when you ask them for feedback, they've no idea what you're talking about. What do you mean feedback? How did it feel? I don't know. Because you told me to do it, I did it, and I've done it. And the problem there is, to some extent, is that what a coach is. Listen, I have this idea, this concept that as a coach, what you are, and this is as a sports scientist, our job is to make ourselves redundant. That's what our job is. Not to make ourselves to the point of absolute unmitigated reliance, where that performer cannot perform without us. I mean, if that is the case, you have failed as a sports scientist or as a coach. What we should be doing is making ourselves redundant. And that redundancy approach means that what I'm doing constantly is educating the people that I work with, so that effectively what they can do is they can do it autonomously. And the positive about that is that as we go along this pathway, as we get more experienced with the athlete or the person that you're working with, the less input you have to give. But you can still charge them the same amount of money, which is all. So you get paid more for less. Don't tell anybody that. No, but that's where success is, though. If because and critically at that point as well, is that when you say to them, look, here's a session, I want you to go away and do it. No other explanation. They go and do it, and then you say to them, right, tell me about it, and they can give you intimate detail about what it felt like, where the problems were, what they did, what were the triggers they used, what was the positive self-talk that they had at a certain place, what did they think, and so therefore it's far more enriching if they've learned through the process. They become a better athlete, because remember, when they are in competition, and I say this in the documentary, interestingly, is that when you are fighting with self, that is what it is. It is isolating. It is low. It's a very lonely place when you're in misery, because you can't share that. But handling it will only come from the way in which you've prepared for it. And if you are autonomous in that process, you're much better able to cope with it and keep going.
Returning to the documentary and sticking to the theme of fighting with yourself, take us through the events that happened throughout the documentary, because things got cancelled. It was during COVID, wasn't it? Things got cancelled, you changed plans, and then when you changed plans, there were storms and all kinds of things. So I suppose to finish off today, I'd love to get a sort of an overview for the audience of the kind of experiences that you had, the challenges that were thrown at you, and which I suppose tested your mental flexibility, toughness, strength, skill, agility, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, sort of as the sort of the precursor of that conversation is, I think that we spoke an awful lot about planning and preparation, and the planning, and I think often where people do get it wrong is this idea that the plan is set in stone and that's what it is, and you have to stick to it, and there's no flexibility in it. And I think the crucial thing to remember is that actually it has to be flexible, it has to change, it has to be responsive to what's actually going on around you. I think it's those that are fixed and people refuse to move away from that plan. That's where you come unstuck. And I think the documentary really sort of articulates that beautifully. From the very beginning was the start of training, and we moved instantly into lockdown and the COVID pandemic. That led to a whole host of issues, around things like the closure of leisure facilities, so swimming pool closures, gym closures, the sort of mainstay of training, particularly in the UK in the winter, and then there were restrictions on how often you could go out of the house, how far away from the house you could go. So all of those were curtailed as well. And so therefore, what your training plan looks like this, but actually now what you've got to do is think, well, what I've got to do, that's the plan, but now it's got to become, I've got to flex on that and move it about so that I can actually do it. And part of it, and it's funny, it looks a bit rocky, some of it. We're in the green gym, we're outside, but we're doing strength work in the woods, and because that was the only place you could do strength work. And interestingly enough, the idea is, just buy yourself some equipment. You couldn't get it in lockdown. Anybody who tried to buy any equipment, you couldn't buy it because everybody was buying it. So, but actually, that adaptation is fantastic, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to do, because in terms of the psychology of it, it's amazing to complete a session that you thought a couple of days earlier you'd never be able to do because you haven't got the equipment and the gym's closed. And here I am doing this session. It's amazing that you can sort of reinforce that process. And then we were going to Patagon, and I mean, these things take a lot of organisation, particularly with film crews and everything. So we're going to Patagonia in Chile, and credit to the organisers, they were really trying to get it to happen. But it kept changing worldwide, and sadly, in the province called Asen province, which is where the race was, they had a rise in cases. 3 weeks before, they said it might be cancelled. 2 weeks before, they said it might be cancelled. We were still working at it, and then 10 days before we were supposed to fly out, cancelled. And so you think, all of that work that's been done in preparation for this one challenge, very specific challenge. So we'd been in the altitude chamber, because we were going up to altitude. We'd planned meticulously the type of work that was required to be successful. All of a sudden, gone. And I think, and again, I think in the documentary I talk about this, that I think I take a very different approach, and plenty of people take this approach, but I think there were multiple places where you could just say, well, that's it, we're done. It's just not going to happen. It's a shame, but we'll just stop here. But I sadly have this, and that was where Unstoppable came in terms of the title of the documentary, was that actually, don't stop. All we've got to do is just evolve, just change the plans. So eventually we came up with this plan to go to Scotland as part of the Keltman. We knew that we'd struggle because it was northwest of Scotland in winter, and you only get about 7 hours of daylight, and so therefore we were going to be restricted. So we knew we'd have to squash it somewhat. Obviously, there were environmental issues because it's incredibly cold, both water and air. And then 7 days before we flew up, they were forecasting Storm Barra to come in. So this grade 4 storm, and lo and behold, it arrived about halfway through the challenge, and boy, it arrived with some vengeance. Again, and what that meant was actually during the challenge itself, we had to adapt slightly. We were going to go up into the Monrose on the run. We decided to stay on the roads because it was safe. It was much safer on the roads than anywhere else. And so I guess, to some extent, it's just an articulation of the fact that because you have to change your plans doesn't mean to say that you have to stop that you have to stop in that process. Is that I just think make sure that the plan itself is flexible and make sure that you are robust enough to keep going in the sure and certain knowledge that plans change, but you can still deliver.
It was fascinating to watch it unfold on the documentary, which is a fantastic watch. And I did like the Rocky-esque scenes in the woods. It just didn't have the 80s synth music. I had the time.
Could have tried.
I mean, that would have just
they wouldn't choose it. It's too expensive.
Yeah, that's true. I think my final question comes to you, Andy, today, which is one of your oldest friends, Greg, here. I want your professional opinion on him. He went in the winter to the northwest of Scotland to do some kind of triathlon event on his own. As one of our experienced psychologists, one of the most experienced psychologists in the UK, can you say that Greg is sane, or is he certifiably insane?
What I saw him do in 1988 was much worse.
Oh, really? Oh, God.
Let's not mention that.
Well, he pushed me to. I was encouraged. I think the documentary is fantastic. I watched it, came out. I've watched Norseman, and of course, Greg and I have worked a lot together. And I think what you've got from there is the detailed planning, which creates a sense of you really do need to know your challenge. But within that, you've got the importance of reflection, of pulling out, what did I learn from that? What information was useful that I take forwards, which builds my belief that I can do this challenge. And that in all, with all the celebrities he's worked with, or the ones I know about, that comes out so well. And, he talks about the elite. Well, the group of the four swimmers who swam the channel, they were definitely not elite, but they had this rock solid mental toughness that they can do it, which had been developed. They were not athletes, but they became rock solid in their determination. And those are lovely examples to go. It's not about the elite, because it's about that nurturing of where you are from now, and actually you can change your interpretation of how physical activity feels, and you can achieve a lot more than what you think. You can just move that barrier, and it's reflection, planning, learning, and pulling that out. It sounds a bit clever, but it's just putting a program in that allows that, and allowing that statement, nothing good comes easy. And at the point of when you're feeling absolutely miserable, I actually think that's when you should kind of relish in it, because it sometimes takes 3 or 4 hours to get to that point of misery. And I'm training for something that takes 10 hours. I've actually got a magnificent opportunity to be in this depleted state. So I'll make the most of it.
I tell you, as Andy's talking there, it just reminds me that there was a lovely quote from, I think it was Arnold Palmer, who said that the harder I work, the luckier I get. And the one thing I would always say, I think what Andy is alluding to is this idea that people have a perception that you're born lucky, or you're born successful, or you're born motivated. To my mind, the balance of nature versus nurture, what we're born with by what we develop, is absolutely, almost exclusively linked to the nurture piece. And I think that all of us, everybody listening to this, has the opportunity to achieve something that they currently don't believe that they can do. You just have to develop that approach.
And I think the person who said, I think that was Gary Player.
Yeah.
But I say that not to correct you, but actually just to say, I think he's a prime example of somebody who said that and lives that life. And Greg, I was a professional golfer, so golf is my background. So, he is a ball of energy in his mid-80s.
Wow.
So, he kind of, a neat way to finish here is he kind of is the embodiment of everything you've both been speaking to this past hour. Guys, thank you so much for this. Just absolutely fascinating. And coming to you, Greg, how can people find this documentary, watch it? How can people find you and follow you on social media?
Well, if you find Andy, because he has been stalking me for years, and I honestly, I can't since 1988 actually.
I have.
No, do you know,
That's just why you went to Scotland, just to get rid of him.
that's why I went to the States.
Right, fair enough.
No, do you know, YouTube channel. So all my documentaries, and in fact all the films, many and some other ones that we haven't spoken about, today that link very much into this, or on my YouTube channel, free to view. Just sign up and you get all the updates, and we're constantly putting new content on there. And then on social media, at Prof Greg W on Insta and at GP Whyte on Twitter. But yeah, I mean, I just love interaction. If anybody's got any questions or anything like that, through those channels, feel free, because I think it's what me and Andy will tell you. It's what keeps us alive, really. And the questions are what drive and direct future research in this area.
And Andy, where can people find you, follow you?
Anywhere I am.
I was going to say, plugging these channels. But my Twitter handle, I'm Instagram. I think it's chat with a prof. My Twitter handle, but my Instagram, but the Twitter is Andy Lane 27 at Twitter.
His age.
Guys, thank you so much for today.
Absolute pleasure.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listeners, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.